Hello, everyone. I'm Margarita Kiwis, and I'm the Executive Director of the Peace Innovation Lab at Stanford. The COP26 panel is going to cover climate change. So this conference is coming up in November of 2021. The UK will host. It is a global climate summit of world leaders convened by the United Nations. COP26 is widely regarded by many as the world's best last chance to get runaway climate change under control. Now, I'm going to introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Susan Lee. She is part of the core delivery team for the Global Assembly of COP26. She is a student and activist from Seoul, Korea. In 2016 and 2017, she worked at We All Govern Lab, a Seoul-based democracy startup where she translated and conducted research on civic participation and democratic innovation. Since then, she has been working in global deliberative governance with a focus on iterative pilot testing and youth activation. Susan has published works such as The Challenge of Global Deliberative Democracy and spoken a video explaining the Global Assembly for COP26 for the COP26 Climate Ambition Summit 2020. And she is currently finishing her studies in political science and religion at Amherst College. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you so much, Margarita. I'm very happy to be here.
Wonderful. My next panelist is Richard Lochhead, member of the Scottish Parliament, Minister for Just Transition, Employment and Fair Work. Richard was first elected as a Northwest MSP in 1999 before winning the Moray by-election in 2006. He was previously the Cabinet Secretary for Rural Affairs, Food and Environment, and Minister for Further Education, Higher Education, and Science. He was appointed Minister for Just Transition, Employment, and Fair Work in May 2021. Welcome, Richard, to our panel.
Nice to join you. Thanks very much for having me along.
Yes, wonderful. So we have some we're going to have a talk about the connection between climate and peace. So Susan, I want to start with you. What is the Global Assembly's role in relation to COP26?
Thank you so much, Margarita. I think a good place to start would be by explaining the project to begin with. So I'm joining you today from the Global Assembly. We're a group organizing the first ever Global Citizens Assembly on climate change for COP26. And what this means in very simple terms is that we're organizing a citizens assembly of 100 people, everyday people coming from all different walks of life, who form a representative sample of the global human family. This means that these 100 people were selected using a civic lottery as opposed to an election, for instance. And this snapshot of the human family is going to come together online to deliberate and learn about climate change and plot more fair and effective ways of moving forward as a shared humanity. And so this group is going to be presenting their findings at COP26. This is, of course, why I'm joining you today on this panel. They're also going to be observing the conversations and negotiations that take place at COP and going to deliberate after the COP26 proceedings end to reflect back on the conversations they observed and observe if what they saw at COP is actually accountable to the principles and outputs that they had delivered before the start of the COP assembly. And so the snapshot is at the core of our project for this year. They're going to be accompanied by community assemblies that can be run by anyone, anywhere around the world using an open access toolkit that we're developing, including the same learning materials as the core assembly, as well as facilitation guidelines to allow communities wherever they are in the world, even if they weren't selected by the global location lottery, to engage and mirror the journey of the core assembly. And so speaking to this question, Margarita, to our relationship with the COP process, I think it's useful to sort of zoom out into what we're trying to accomplish in a long-term scale at the macro level. The project itself stems from a very simple realization that there's a missing piece in how we make decisions at the global level. And this missing piece is us, right? It's everyday citizens. And recognizing this lack of a fundamental sort of infrastructure to provide this node of civic intelligence, this is where our project comes in. And we hope that the Global Assembly becomes a permanent infrastructure that exists alongside these other nodes and the sort of global governance ecosystem that provides citizens' voices. So in terms of COP, this is our first year of docking onto an existing institutional body at the global level. And so not only are the participants going to present their findings at COP, the key part here is that they're not just done after they sort of present what they had deliberated on at COP. Rather, in the methodology of being able to observe COP and actually be able to, as Gen Z would say, clap back to COP, we're exploring sort of the beginnings of what a relational sort of relationship really would look like between a body like this composed of citizens and an existing infrastructure in global governance. And so at COP, we're exploring this for the first year in 2021.
Fantastic. Richard, tell me, how is Scotland helping to achieve an ambitious outcome at COP26?
Just listening to Susan there, I actually was speaking to representatives from the Scottish Citizens' Assembly today, who reported recently, and that, as it says in the title, was a representative sample of the people of Scotland who came together for the first ever Citizens' Assembly on climate change. That was very interesting to hear what Susan was saying on a sort of more global scale, that we've been doing that in Scotland for the first time as well. But in terms of your question, Margarita, clearly we are very proud to be hosting COP26. It's the UK that's hosting it, and it's taking place in Scotland. So the Scottish Government clearly has got a very close interest in that. And what we have been doing over the last few years is trying to show a global lead in terms of setting really ambitious targets. We've set targets for Scotland to achieve net zero by 2045. The UK is 2050. And, we are trying to put our money where our mouth is and make sure that this run up to COP26 shows that Scotland's prepared to play our role, and that hopefully the rest of the world, when they gather in Glasgow, are willing to match their words with action as well, because as we all know, this is a case of no time to waste. We have to take action if we're going to save humankind and the planet. So Scotland's trying to lead by example, I guess, is really what I'm saying here, and that's how we're approaching COP26. And there's lots of activities that will be happening in Scotland. Clearly, the Scottish Government will be closely engaged with the UK Government in some of the events around the actual gathering of the summits in Glasgow as well. So it's a huge event for the country. As you can imagine, in Scotland, discussion of climate change and the net zero has really been heightened, and it's rocketed up the top of the political agenda because we're hosting COP26. It's acting as a real catalyst for Scotland as well. And hopefully for the rest of the world, clearly, because we have to now move towards delivery, because we know what needs to be done.
So, Richard, can I ask a follow-up question? How is Scotland experiencing climate change right now?
Well, clearly Scotland is, like the rest of the world, seeing with their own eyes the impact of climate change in our own country. We've seen unprecedented extreme weather events, whether it's hot days or cold days or wet weather. Some of the indicators of what's supposed to happen every 100 years now is happening every 1 or 2 years. So people in Scotland, I think, are now beginning to waken up to the impact of climate change. Now, clearly, we look at what's happening across the rest of the world, which we can also see in our TV screens. There's some real crisis taking place, or extreme weather events we've seen on our TV screens from across the whole of the world. We might not have quite as extreme events here in Scotland, but we are experiencing unprecedented weather patterns, and the climate is obviously changing. So people are now very much alert to that. We've had more, flooding events and extreme weather events in recent times.
Yeah, excellent. It seems like there's no place on the planet that is immune to the change. We're all feeling it in different ways. Susan, in Korea, what are you seeing?
I think the key thing to flag here is that, so I grew up in Korea. I was born and raised there, and I don't think I realized that climate change was present in my life until I really had a chance to reflect on this sort of presentness of this in an immediate way in my life until the pandemic happened and everyone started talking about masks. So, when the pandemic kicked off, many of my friends from across the world, not in Korea, would come to me and complain about how much it was a paradigm shift that they had to start wearing face masks. And it was at that moment when I started to reflect back on my childhood growing up in the middle of Seoul, where masks were part of my daily reality. It was just something that my parents would intuitively add into my lunchbox or sort of school supplies as they sent me off to school every morning. It would be routine to check our phones and see what the microparticle pollution levels were at that time, and to then prepare for the rest of the school day in that manner. And so it was part and parcel of feeling the effects at an everyday level of systemic changes and degradations that were happening elsewhere. And so it's something that's quite clearly been present throughout my childhood, and I'm sure in the childhoods of all of my Korean peers and young people. And of course, there are more immediate ways in which we feel it in our lives. More recently, for instance, sort of the sporadic monsoon seasons that we had, these constants of life in which you enter into the summer break knowing that there's going to be 2 weeks sort of in the middle of July where it's pouring, and this has been a constant throughout our entire lives. These sort of taken for granted pillars of reality in a given geographic location just being quite easily altered and sporadically changed. I think it's in these sort of disruptions of everyday familiarities that I feel climate change, of course, with the asterisks that this sort of example of how I feel climate change in my personal life in Korea only forms a fraction, of course, of what my other young peers are going through in their corners of the world every single day. But yeah, I would want to share that.
Thank you. So I want to ask a question of both of you. What are the obstacles to government making and sticking to meaningful commitments at COP26? It's like, I know that everyone's like, we need to do something about it, right? And so there's been a lot of meetings, conferences, convenings, and so on, talking about something happening. How is COP26 going to be different, and how can we see that a real commitment is made?
Well, I'm happy to go first. It's a very good question, and this is COP26, so there have been previous global summits to tackle climate change, but I think hopefully there's now a recognition that this is about action and about delivery, and not just talking about what needs to be done in the future, but actually signing up to action now and signing up what countries are actually going to do. And I noticed that President Biden is in the news this evening saying that the US, I think, are going to double their climate finance contribution. So that's obviously a big step forwards, and it's that kind of action and commitment we're going to need from the other countries and other global leaders who are gathering in Glasgow at COP26. So I guess it's what's lacking, or what we need, is courage, boldness, bravery, and a recognition that this can't be delayed any longer. We don't have much time left to make sure that we limit, global warming to 1.5 degrees and do what's got to be done to save the mankind and the planet. I mean, it's as big as that. And I think, the world population is beginning to recognise that's the case, but we need the leaders to lead, and they're the ones that are gathering in Glasgow. So I hope it's not going to be a case of, everyone just keeping their cards close to their chest to make sure someone else has got to go first and make their commitment first, and then they'll maybe, say, okay, we'll do the same. We want people to lead from the front, and that's got to be about leadership and boldness.
Thank you. Susan, what do you think? Just from the Gen Z, just the younger generation, what do you want? What do you think is the obstacles for government, and especially with your participation with the General Assembly and all the work that you've done so far?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would start off by just agreeing with everything that's been said. And I think insofar as the Global Assembly project stems from first trying to identify, right, what are the deficits at the moment, and how decisions are made at the global level? What concretely are those obstructions that block meaningful commitments, right? This is the kind of interrogation that allows us then as a project at the Global Assembly to determine, okay, what kind of model do we need to try to supplement these deficits by evolving the process and the structure of how decisions are made in the first place? And I think one thing that we've always been conscious of going into this, one understanding, is that global governance is in many ways, right, it's a moral space. As the geeks in my team would like to call it, the global city is very often a moral city, particularly in cases when there's sort of a lack of clear decision rules. And consider the fact that at the same time, the world is becoming increasingly more polarized. I mean, I think Gen Z, if I were to speak from that sort of facet of my identity, is holding witness to how little it seems we can agree on things anymore that are at the basic level, let alone sort of the fundamental basements of at the level of ethics and norms. And so when this sort of, I want to say reality or paradigm, whatever you want to call it, is coupled with people having debates or negotiations on policies, of course we're not going to be able to find common grounds and agree in meaningful ways, right? I think even I know as a kid that policies themselves are suffused and presuppose certain morals or ethics or principles, right? I mean, I think a recent example in the pandemic, lockdown policies make it clear that even if policies don't explicitly surface values, they're still very much undergirded by certain fundamental ethical questions about who pays and how do we distribute the burdens and so on and so forth. And so actually what we want to do at the project is take a step back beyond those policies and engage with that first more fundamental question around the concepts of fairness and around these principles that are going to inevitably undergird any sort of policies that get put on the chopping block at COP or otherwise. And so traditionally speaking, I'm really happy to see to talk about the precedents of the Scottish assemblies as well. Of course, everyone at the team is a geek on process, but you'll see sort of traditionally that often citizens' assemblies end up presenting as their outputs these very granular policy recommendations. And we are sort of taking an intentional departure from this model at the Global Assembly. Rather, the citizen participants for this year are going to talk about and deliberate on sort of 3 different parameters of fairness principles. So first being intergenerational, which is who pays. You know, does my generation pay? Do my kids' generations pay? Do their kids' generations pay? And so this is intergenerational fairness. And then there's the key piece of international fairness, right? Who has to pay more? Countries who have sort of historical increased complicity in the situation we see today, or complete equitable flatline. And then concepts of national fairness around equity and different actors. And so these are the kinds of undergirding principles that the participants are going to produce as opposed to granular policy recommendations in order to take us to that conversation that we feel is being bypassed in these global sort of discussions. And I think it's quite easy, and I had this intuitive reaction first. Many of us tend to shirk sort of instinctively from conversations around ethics or morals or principles because they seem sort of so culturally specific, right? Principles are perhaps the most culturally specific sort of facets of life in many instances. And it's actually precisely because of this that we feel we need to actually surface and engage in deliberation about these various and sometimes dissonant, sometimes resonant principles that all of these different people are bringing together. Because if we don't engage in that discussion, and often, you know, these global discussions don't engage in those fundamental conversations about values, we often actually end up with policies that still have values embedded in them, but that only reflects sort of dominant or singular and therefore, in my view, impoverished principles that don't reflect the whole kaleidoscope of sort of worldviews that exist there, and in that way obstruct meaningful commitment and common ground.